This report was written under life cause and with the aim of facilitating the conversation.
Very interesting. James.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was you next, no? The follow-up question.
No, it's you.
Oh, okay. This will all be smoothed out in the edits.
Cut.
James says, okay, great.
Okay, great.
Welcome everyone, and this is another episode of the FSR Policy Briefcase with me, Leonardo Meeus.
And me, James Kneebone.
By now you should know that we're available on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and wherever you are, please remember to give us a thumbs up, a comment, or you could even register as a subscriber. Anyway, today we are joined by Simone. Simone Borghesi is the director of our climate area at Florence School of Regulation. He's a professor at the UI. He's also a professor at the University of Siena, where he's even a vice rector of the university. So he keeps busy because he's also the president of the European Association of Environmental Economics, but still smiling. So.
Yes. Keep smiling, that's my motto.
So Simone and his team, they are very active on carbon markets and policy. And the trigger of today's episode was the report they made, and it's also a policy brief now, on state of play in international carbon markets. Now, James and I know just the basics, so we read the report and we learned a lot, Simone. Also, I noticed there are 38 emission trading schemes. That's really many more than I thought. You know, it's from the EU to China and also in smaller countries like New Zealand. The US does not yet have a federal scheme, I learned, but they do already have 13 schemes at state level, right? And you also discuss in your report that there are new possible countries joining the club of carbon markets. For instance, Brazil, India, and Turkey are quite advanced in the process. So that's really interesting. You also discuss the different reforms that are going on, and several of the questions will go in that direction. But before we dive into that, can you maybe tell us a bit more on in which context this report was published? There was a project, Life Cause, if I understood, and there is also this Florence Process. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I'll tell you a little story about this. I have an anecdote to start with. When I arrived at FSR in 2017, the very first workshop that we had was a workshop with the regulators of the main ETSs. And on that occasion, I launched an idea, why don't we create an observatory on the various ETSs? That event was very successful, I would say, and the Commission decided to repeat it next year, and then the following year, over and over again. So basically, we have this meeting every year, and it was named by the Commission the Florence Process because it happens here. And it's an occasion in which the regulator exchanges information on the functioning and also the challenges of the ETSs. Life Cause has this nice acronym that reminds us of the Nobel Prize economist, but COSE stands for Collaborative Observatory on Emission Trading System. So basically on the assessment of emission trading system. So basically, it realizes what was proposed at the very beginning. And it's a project that looks at the data to exchange information among the regulators and also create international collaboration, reinforce international collaboration. So this report was written under Life Cause and with the aim of facilitating the conversation that take place at the Florence Process.
Very interesting. James.
Okay, great. Now perhaps we could talk a little bit about reform. So the report illustrates there are at least 3 reforms going on in parallel. So one is to extend the scope of a scheme in a certain jurisdiction to more sectors. The second about linking the schemes of different jurisdictions. And the third about whether you allow carbon removal projects or emission reduction projects outside of the scope of your ETS to compete with emission reduction projects within your ETS, right? So these so-called carbon offsetting credits projects can be in other sectors or even in other countries. So first, I'd like to ask, on the extension of this scope, it seems that most schemes start with the electricity sector and then gradually expand their scope. Is there a limit to expanding the scope, or can these schemes eventually cover the whole economy?
Well, sky's the limit. In theory, there are no limits, and actually most emission trading system extended over time. Certainly the European one, but I see, for instance, China that is planning to extend beyond the power sector to cement, steel, aluminium, and so on. In practice, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they aren't. And in practice, that's where the implementation gets difficult for other sectors, because each sector has idiosyncratic features that require attention. So just to give an example, think of agriculture. In the case of agriculture, extending carbon pricing to agriculture and creating an ETS, which is named in jargon ETS3, is not going to be easy because of data availability, because problems with monitoring, but also because of public acceptance. I think this is the major obstacle, to be honest, for the extension to some sectors. And this somehow applies also to something that is already in the mind of the regulator, or actually in its phase of implementation. I'm talking about ETS2 and the extension to building and transport. We need to proceed with caution because this is going to have an impact much more than ETS1 on the citizens, on the general public. So I'm very much in favor, to be honest, of extending the ETSs, but we should be very cautious in doing that.
Yeah, it's kind of this nexus between
policies that address sustainability and the sustainability of
policies themselves, right? If you move too quickly and then the policy therefore doesn't have longevity, it doesn't ultimately achieve its aim in its original.
I never thought in these terms. I like it. I will reuse it.
And on that, I have a follow-up question, because one thing we discuss a lot now in Europe is the competitiveness of European industry. Related to that was to what extent in the EU ETS industry is impacted, and then should we worry about carbon leakage with industry just moving away? We have that very famous carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe now. But how are the others dealing with that? Is that only in Europe a concern, or some of the other ETSs have also been discussing that?
It's not only Europe a concern, but Europe was the first to move in this direction. And the CBAM is a game changer in my view. Okay, something that changes the nature of the game, even if not implemented, because basically it's not been implemented yet, but it has already produced some results. And to be honest, I think this is what Europe wanted. Probably Europe wouldn't even want CBAM to be implemented at any point, but if the threat works, then it's enough. It has been successful. What I see is that other ETSs start considering CBAM. The UK, Canada, even Turkey, that is about to start with an ETS, is already considering an ETS with CBAM. So in this sense, I think it has been useful. Now, some jurisdictions cannot adopt a CBAM because it does not depend on them. Leo, you said the US has no carbon pricing at federal level. It's true. So there are carbon pricing and ETS systems all over, well, not all over, but in many jurisdictions, many regions, states of the US, but not at the federal level. These states cannot set up a tariff on their own. Okay, at subnational level, they cannot decide for a CBAM. However, they take care of the carbon leakage risk with other instruments. For instance, in the case of California, you have the sector at risk of carbon leakage that have been identified. And basically, it's the same criterion as the one in Europe. the energy intensive and trade exposed sectors that receive free allowances.
Okay.
It was the same in Europe. It has been the same in Europe so far, although now free allowances should be replaced by CBAM. So you have either the one or the other.
Yeah.
This is still under discussion, but that's how we should proceed.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay.
Clear.
Interesting, yeah. And of course, on the other side, you have the removals, right? So you can put a price on the emissions, but you can also remove carbon from the atmosphere or avoid its emission where currently it's being emitted. And in your policy brief, you talk about 3 types. So engineered carbon removal, so this might be something like direct air capture, I guess, in the most obvious sense. You have nature-based removal, so I think we're all familiar with that. And yeah, the third cluster being emissions reductions. So maybe a switch from fossil to renewable energy, something like this in an industrial plant or something, to give an obvious example. I understand that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement also plays a crucial role in how these are defined and framed. Perhaps you could just explain us a little bit the basics of the controversies related to these different types of offsetting credits, because I understand it's quite a contentious issue.
Yeah, it's a contentious issue, and I have to say it's also a bit technical and difficult issue for me as well. Yeah. The basic idea is that we want or need to compensate our own emissions by reducing or removing or preventing emissions. That's the basic idea. And let me add, we also need these kind of instruments to increase liquidity in a future perspective, because as the cap gets closer to zero, the market has less liquidity. So this can be a way to maintain or enhance the liquidity as we get to the end or towards net zero. Now, how we can do that? You summarize it very well. Each of these types of carbon offsets has pros and cons. So the engineer one, the technological one, have the advantage of being measurable and long-lasting. Good. But they are expensive. Yeah. And they are difficult to be increased, deployed at large scale. Nature-based solutions are, in my view, really the opposite, because they are difficult to measure. They can be not long-lasting. They have a permanence problem. Think of afforestation. If the forest burns, then the CO2 goes back into the atmosphere. And they may create land use conflicts, because you use land for something that cannot be used for other things. So create some tensions at social level sometimes. On the positive side, certainly nature-based solutions are cheaper, even much cheaper than the technology-based solutions. I was looking at the numbers, and basically nature-based solutions go in a range that goes from 10 to 100, whereas technology-based solutions most of the time starts from 100 and goes to 1,000. I'm talking about dollars per ton of CO2. So they're certainly cheaper, and they also have the advantage of creating multiple ecological benefits, because nature-based solutions, if properly done, they preserve the ecosystem, water quality, biodiversity, all things that we need to factor in. So they can be a very powerful instrument. The problems are that even though Article 6 has finally done some steps forward, there are still implementation issues that are open, like the double counting issue or the additionality, the MRV, all these kind of problems that, in my view, have not been totally solved yet, and I think will be the object of much discussion at the next COPs. That's what I expect.
And what about this third group of emissions reductions? So I guess this is the idea that you're kind of avoiding emissions that would otherwise have been produced. This can also be a form of
offset, right? I mean, it sounds kind of strange when you put it like that. It's not actually sequestering anything directly, but it's avoiding emissions. Yes. And we might derive some value from that.
I think this is even more problematic, because we often lack what, as economists, we call a counterfactual, okay? A benchmark that you can use to compare whether you perform better or not. So in my view, it's a personal, subjective view, but avoidance is a bit tricky, whereas the other forms are more measurable despite the difficulties that I mentioned before. And I also believe that is why avoidance has been put a bit aside for the moment. However, I look at the numbers, I look at the projects, and at the beginning, most of the projects were based on avoidance.
Okay.
So this is also a bit risky, no? Because avoidance is more vague.
And they got a bad reputation as a result of it, right?
Exactly.
And that's why they will pull back in a sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the most risky aspect, reputation, as you said, Leo. Because if there is one project that goes wrong, then the reputation effect is negative for all projects, even the good ones. Yeah. And, if I may add, also for the compliance market. Because people will say, okay, then the ETS is just forget about it, okay? Even ETS 1 or whatever you want to call it, the carbon markets in general. Whereas in my view, well, they can be improved, but we saw some effective actual results. In Europe, for instance, the ETS covered sectors reduced their emissions by 47% since 2005 when the system started. So, okay, I'm not saying that this is a silver bullet, but it's a good bullet that we should use to target emissions reduction.
Can I go to the next topic? Because we really wanted to ask you a few questions about linking. Another important aspect of your report. You talk about linking, the fact that some ETSs of different jurisdictions have been linked. Examples are EU, Switzerland, California, Quebec. 11 states in the US grouped themselves under the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And we didn't know when we were inviting you to the podcast, but meanwhile, it seems the EU and the UK have also announced
That's why you called me.
Indeed, because now we need to know, what does that mean? You seem to be positive about it in your report, but why is it beneficial to link markets? And can you also explain a little bit more the challenges? Because I understand the difference in technicalities between schemes sometimes makes it harder to link. And that comes back to the thing we were just discussing, that maybe different schemes have different practices in regarding offsets, but also something which I'll ask it as a follow-up question. Let me first let you answer more generally, because there is a very specific thing on these caps that is the technical highlight to keep at the end, maybe.
So the difficult question for the end.
Yes, exactly.
I'll take some time on this question, so in the meantime I think about it. Okay, well, those who know me, they know that I'm very fond of linking because it's a general approach that I like, cooperation among countries and jurisdictions. But there are also technical advantages in linking, because when you link two ETSs, the liquidity increases, which means that if you are an ETS actor, you have more chances to find someone who wants to buy your allowances or from whom you want to get allowances. So more trade possibilities. Secondly, and I think this is the best aspect, linking drives price convergence. If I link to another system, the price of my ETS and the other ETS will converge to the same price level. And this goes back to your previous question. Carbon leakage, the incentive to delocalization disappears because you pay the same price everywhere. So in an ideal world, in the nirvana of the economist, if you had a global carbon market, there would be no carbon leakage by definition. Third aspect that I like of linking is that you can share best practices. And that's what happens at the Florence process, okay? Because regulators have a frank conversation on what works and what doesn't work. So by linking, you really learn much more. So I don't want to say that we linked among all the regulators for the process, but certainly that's the principle of exchanging information. And finally, I like the fact that through linking, you do something. It's a bottom-up solution because we learned the hard way that we have difficulties with global solutions, global agreements. Whereas with linking, you do little steps. If I link with you, we get to a same price. If I link with James, we get to the same price. Then automatically, the two of you are basically linked. So this is a way we can proceed. Now, everything has troubles. So although I support linking has not occurred much. You mentioned a few cases, but there are just a few. And also taking time. And to explain why it takes time, probably the main reason is the fact that when you link to another system, you have to give up your sovereignty, some control over your own ETS. So it depends on you as much as on the other.
Yeah, in the case of offsets, it basically means I keep bad offsets out of my scheme, but if I link with you, the offsets can go through the back door and come back to me, basically.
Exactly. That's one aspect.
Yeah.
And another aspect is that when you link to someone, this creates a flow of money, of transfers from one ETS to the other. So, sometimes this flow can be very large, and maybe you don't want this to go from you to the other. You like it, but not so much. When I explain this to my students, I always use the metaphor of a marriage, because getting married is pretty similar to getting linked to another ETS, with all the advantages and disadvantages that a marriage implies. And this, of course, applies also to the case that you were mentioning, EU and UK. UK was a key element, a key country in the EU ETS. Actually, they were a forerunner, basically, in emission trading systems. So Brexit was a bit shocking, also because it determined a separation between the EU ETS and the newly born UK ETS. But there were many requests, actually, from the market itself, the companies themselves, the stakeholders, to relink the two systems. So I don't know how it's going to end up, but certainly there would be many good reasons to get together again, in my view.
I'm certainly hoping for a remarriage of the UK and EU. If it starts with the linking of carbon markets...
Well, you start bringing your stuff back home, and then maybe...
Exactly, piece by piece. Start with carbon.
So on the technical question, so I was also intrigued by the fact that you categorize certain schemes as saying they have an absolute cap, and then some others, they have an intensity-based cap. I know it's a bit technical, but still, can you tell us at least partly what that's about, and how that is also maybe making linking more difficult if you have one or the other type of cap?
Yes, indeed. Linking is easier with another system that is similar to you. All ETSs are different, to be honest, in some respects. But these two aspects are key. It's more difficult to link with someone that has a different cap system, absolute versus intensity-based, or that approaches the offsets in a different way because of the integrity, transparency issue, and so the control that you risk to lose. In the case of absolute versus relative or intensity-based, let me see how I can explain it in simple words. With an absolute cap, your cap is based on total emissions. So when the cap falls, it means that the amount of total emissions has to fall, no matter what you do, no matter your production level, full stop. With an intensity-based, it's emission intensity that needs to decrease over time. Emission intensity is emissions over GDP, okay? So with this system, you allow for production increase as long as the production gets cleaner.
I see.
Because lower emission intensity means cleaner production. It is more flexible.
Yes.
It is more consistent with economic aspect of increasing production. And so probably it's more suitable for developing countries who want to keep growing.
And that explains why China and what is it, India
And so on and so forth.
are
Okay.
preferring this scheme.
And in this respect, it's reasonable. On the other hand, let me say that nature doesn't care about emission intensity. Nature cares about the amount of total emissions that is in the atmosphere and that causes global warming. So we should aim at reducing total emissions. So in my view, again, it's personal opinion, but in my view, we should move progressively from intensity-based to absolute cap.
Yeah, but in a sense, as also in the EU, we've gradually sort of made our scheme stricter. You could maybe forgive some of the countries to start with an intensity-based scheme and also, become stricter over time.
It's the topic of feasibility, political acceptability of things that comes back. You don't want to kill the system from scratch because it's too strict. So I'm okay with allowing intensity-based system, but I think we should progressively converge towards a similar system. Also because ideally we would like to link the system in sometimes in the future, let's say.
Okay, very clear.
It feels like the CBAM question somewhat brings the conversation about linking and sort of the relationships between different ETS systems really to the fore, no? Because it essentially kind of exports the price and the principles of the EU system into other countries where previously they didn't obviously interact. So it kind of confronts us with these questions more immediately, doesn't it?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it was probably the main reason, or if not the only reason, to have a CBAM, because you want to have a similar carbon price. You don't want to, let's say, you want to protect the competitiveness of your own industry. But probably this term is misleading because it was not done for internal reason. It was done to induce the others to adopt the carbon pricing. So both elements are important, but in my view now the whole focus is on competitiveness, but really we should not forget that there is the environmental component that motivated, because otherwise, if we do big efforts but the others don't, then you're shooting in your feet and it makes no sense even from the environmental viewpoint. So the ultimate goal must be that everybody is on board in these efforts. And that's why CBAM can make sense. I'm not, saying that, again, it's the solution of all scenes. It's not. But we need to find ways to proceed. And because we are stuck, to be honest, we are stuck. We proceed too slowly in international climate policies. So CBAM, linking, ETSs, everything that works should be adopted.
That's a good message, I think, no? And in some cases, right, a pursuit for perfection shouldn't, deter us from what is a good enough system that is moving things in the correct direction.
We are very far from perfection, but at least if we move, it's a good start.
Yeah, creating good outcomes. Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I encourage listeners to go and take a look at the policy brief. It's really informative. It's really well written. Covers a lot of these key pieces that we discussed today. Yeah, everything from these linking issues to voluntary systems, compliance systems, offsets, removals, all these different subjects. And yeah, it's bang up to date. I mean, you were talking even about this UK-EU discussions, which I think happened even last week. So it's really...
to be honest, we are learning as we go. Yeah. I've always been learning during these years, because I describe it as a moving target. Every time I say, okay, now I understood, no, wait a second, things have changed. There is a reform, the rules are changing. But on the other hand, you need to fine-tune this instrument. So I think it's okay to adjust this instrument. Some people say, you don't have enough stability because the rules are changing. But you need to change as new information occurs, and also from the scientific viewpoint, we are learning. So we're still on the learning curve, and it's normal to adjust the policy instruments.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Simone, for joining us. It's really been a pleasure. And just a last reminder to our listeners to please Subscribe if you're interested in future episodes such as this with Simone. And yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next month with a coming episode.
Ciao.